In this tutorial, I will show you how to create fake user interface graphics. So I created this kind of fake user interface type of graphics where I have a bunch of data flowing through those little jelly beans. The whole thing is animated, and I have some sci-fi sounding planet names of sorts. And what's interesting is that I'm drawing connections between specific data points to the planet names, and the whole thing is animated and responsive. So this is a little bit busy, but if I switch to a single point, you can see how everything's being drawn procedurally, everything's animated, and I have a controller of sorts, which I can easily control the design, can increase or decrease number of data lines, and so on. So I will show you how to create the whole thing. The only thing I need to point out before we start is that this is fake user interface because this is not 100% correct selection. As a quick overview, I have a data flowing from 0 to 100. So the height of these little beans is supposed to be from 0 to 100, animated with a noise node. And I'm selecting basically data up to the value of 20. But as you can see, this is correct, this is potentially correct, but some of them, like this one, is definitely out of range. There is something going on with connect shape node that prevents me from drawing correct connections. And I'll point this out later on in the tutorial. But as a fake user interface type of thing, this works pretty well. If you get lost, I'll make sure to include the project file we're gonna create in this tutorial with a bunch of other tests I made early on. So let's get started. Going to delete this text layer. I have a simple color array with a number of colors. And what I did is simply right click and rename every single node so it's easier later on for me to use into the whole design. So first I'm going to create background shape and simply drag and drop on a fill to have a solid background. We need to create a shape which represents data points for us. And we need to create value array, and I'm going to use this as our master control layer. By using a simple value array, I can have all the different controls in one place, and then this makes it much easier to customize the project as we go on. So first of all, I want to have control of data minimum value and data max. Go back to our shape layer. Going to rename it to keep things organized, and right click on size, add behavior, go all the way to noise, click on height, pin it over here, go to master control, plug it min to min and max to max. As you can see, everything's working. Now I want to control the width of the data itself. Go back to data source, drag and drop on the width. So to style this a little bit, I'm going to basically take the height and drop it into the corner radius. And we don't need such a big number. We can add an expression. This will simply divide the value by half. So we have a nice rounded jelly bean sort of thing. Now let's put this data into Duplicator. So holding Option and click on the Duplicator icon and switch this whole thing to circle. So if I multiply this, you can see how the whole thing's animated. Now the data itself facing the wrong way, we can rotate it with Duplicator shape rotation easily. Going to rename it data source ring to keep things organized. The problem we have is that the data is changing its dimension from the center. So what we can do is to fix this is add an aligned modifier and simply set it to -1 on Y. This way you can see how the whole thing, it just animates from the bottom all the way to top. So we have our base shape for the data viz done. Now we need to put this into another duplicator to create multiple copies of this duplicator. So data source ring selected, hold Option, click on the duplicator icon. I'm going to set it to point, and if I increase this, you can see nothing is really happening because every single copy of this data source ring duplicator is duplicated on top of each other. So you can see how there's multiple shapes stacked on top of each other. So what we need to do is we need to increase the radius with number of copies we are generating with the second duplicator. So I'm going to add math node to the radius, spin it over here, go to master controller, add another row, let's call it data radius, and just link it to the first node. I'm going to change it to 200. We need to increase the radius of the data source rings with every single new copy. To do this, we need to basically get the index context information from the second duplicator and send it back down to the first one. So if I change this radius to something like 90, you can see we have more and more and more copies. Now there's a problem because the very first copy is stuck in the middle. The reason for this is that the arrays in Cavalry are being calculated from 0 to however many copies you make. So the first one is actually 0, second is 1, third one is 2, and so on and so on. We can fix that by adding an expression that will simply add one value to the incoming data. So this is the index context from the second duplicator. So as you can see, we don't have this data in the middle. We have data starting from the radius of 90. So next problem I want to fix is that if I increase the number of copies of shapes in the data source ring, you can see that the very first ring is packed with shapes, but the other ones are less busy. So we can fix that by adding a math node, spin it over here, go to master controller, add another node, going to call it number of data points, drop it into the first field in the math controller, maybe type it like 20, then go to second duplicator, advanced tab, and again grab the index context and drop it into the second field. As you can see, the very first ring disappeared, so simply we have to offset the index context by 1. So now this whole thing looks more balanced. So what is happening is that each data ring is populated with this number of copies and then multiplied by the index number of a shape generated by the second duplicator. So we have 20 copies, 40, 60, and so on and so on. So we have our little database going on really nicely and it's animated. I'm going to call it data viz rings to keep things organized. So as a next step, I want to change the color of the data itself. So I'm going to simply add a submesh modifier to the first ring, go to fill, replace color, right click and add number range to color. And I'm going to take the data min, drop it on this keyframe, select second keyframe, data max, drop it here. Then bring the master controller, pin it, set the data min and drop it on the source minimum, and then data max, drop it on the maximum field. Then I'm going to take noise modifier and drop it on the value field. So what is happening is that the number range to color node simply changes the color of the underlying shapes based on the value. And we're setting the range from 0 to 100 or using the data min, data max. So if I increase this number, everything is updated from one place. And we can make this a little bit more contrasty by pushing the keyframes closer together. Now we can see a few problems because if you look closely, Some of those data beans are really dark like this, but others not so. So something's going on that is changing how this noise data is being interpreted throughout the rings themselves. So as you can see, this data point is really bright, while this one is not. So let's go to the noise. We need to change a few things. With the latest version of Cavalry, the use layer as a seed option was introduced. I'm going to uncheck it. This means that every single layer generates new seed, but this is messing up our calculations. Then I'm going to uncheck the use position context. This is especially important because if I move this layer, the whole thing is animated. So I want to make sure that the noise stays in the same position no matter the position of this duplicator layer. But this still doesn't fix our problem. The last step is to go to the first duplicator, go to Advanced tab, and uncheck use index context. Now everything is correctly remapped. You can see the tiny layers are really dark, the big ones are bright, and the whole thing is animated as it should. I'm going to style this a little bit. In my initial design, I had a 3/4 type of design. So I'm going to change the angle to 270, then go to the second duplicator and rotate the whole thing by 90 degrees. Then add a text shape, go to color array, grab the main text color, drop it on the text shape fill, add an array, and simply you can populate it with the names you want to use. I'm using just random sci-fi sounding names. I'm going to call this Lables. Hold option, drop it into Duplicator, set it to circle, call it something like Planet Lables, and then simply style this a little bit like before. So we have our design done. Now we need to basically create connections between labels themselves on the duplicator. We can do this with connect shapes node. So if I just quickly set up to roughly like this so we can see better. The way connect shape node works is simply create vector lines between points. You pick a source and a target. So in our case, the source itself is the DataVis rings mesh because we want to sample the whole mesh. So just drag and drop it like this. And then a target itself is going to be submesh as well. And I'm going to drop the planet labels here. And the whole thing is really busy. So I'm going to change the number of connections to something like 1. So this is where the things are getting slightly problematic. So as you can see, we are sampling every single data point from DataVis ring duplicator and connecting our labels. Problem is the connections are being made, they are done by basically distance. So we need to make few changes to this connect shape node, and I'm going to just add a 0 to it because I'm going to duplicate it multiple times and I want to keep names consistent. If you want to change how these lines are being connected, we need to change basically the mode from nearest to point index. So this is better, but here's another problem. Every single letter in our planet labels duplicator is being connected to a single point in the DataVis rings shape. So what is happening is that the connect shape layer takes indexes from the DataVis rings and then connects them one by one with every single letter in our planet labels based on the index. So to explain this better, I set up this simple demo scene. So as you can see, in this demo scene, I'm drawing connections only between certain rectangles. And the connections are being drawn are only if the rectangle is higher than 100 pixels. So the bottom duplicator is simply set to linear, same as the top one. The bottom source shape rectangle has simply noise modifier applied to it, which goes from 20 to 200. So the whole thing's animated. And as before, I'm changing the color of the source rectangles over here at the bottom based on these values from really dark to bright. And if I turn off this color material override, you can see this is happening live. This color material override simply changes the color once the connection is made. What is going on is that connect shape in the point index will simply draw a connection between source and target based on the ID. So if I turn on the draw debug information, you can see we have from 0 to 9 IDs. Same here. Everything's matched perfectly. So we can use this to our advantage and simply create some sort of logic gate which will draw the connections if certain criteria is met. So the way you can do this is by adding a submesh to connect shape and then adding a comparison node to the visibility. And I'm using this data in here and have a criteria. If this data is greater than or equal to this value, make a connection. So as you can see, this line is at 100. So everything that is higher than this line has a connection and it changes color at the same time. So we can make a very simple data viz and change the color of the shapes and draw connections based on this logic gate. Now, you need to know a few things about this setup. This only works because the bottom duplicator and the top one have the same amount of indexes. So if I reduce the number of copies in the top duplicator, then we have less lines drawn. And they are only drawn up to the duplicator value 4, which is this one as well. These ones I ignored. So for this to work correctly, we need to have more copies in the connect shape. So then we can select data from our data rings. And one more thing to know is that for these lines to point into a single direction, all the shapes need to be on top of each other. So hopefully this is a little bit more clear now. So let's go back to the tutorial. So what I need to do is a few things. First, I'm going to create a simple ellipse, and this is going to be our placeholder. I'm calling this a placeholder because I'm going to use position data from the text labels, and I'm going to place ellipse on every single label like so, and then I'm going to draw connections to this ellipse instead of the labels themselves. So we'll end up with a single point connection like this. So what we need to do is put this ellipse into a duplicator. Going to call this placeholder position 0, set it to point because I want everything in one place. Then I need to find out the position of the every single label. Next, we need something called get submesh transform layer. This layer will let us get the position data of individual meshes inside the duplicator. So if I grab plaid labels, drop it as an input, we have data of a position and rotation. And simply I can grab the position node and drop it on top of placeholder position like this. And as you can see, we have ellipse stuck to this label. So if I change this, it jumps perfectly from one label to another. So I'm going to call this 0 to match the naming convention. And I'm going to change the text to vertical alignment so it sticks perfectly in the middle. So next we need a few things. If I go to master controller and just pin it here. Now if I turn on the connect shape layer, we can see all the connections being made. Now, if I change the connections limit value to something really low, you can see that we get less and less copies, which is what we want. We can use this value to limit how many copies of the placeholder ellipse we are creating, because this will be useful to optimize our rig. So if I simply add another node and call this connections limit, drop it here and maybe set it to like 100. Then we need to connect this connections limit value with the count on the placeholder. So then we have exactly the same amount of connections as the copies. Okay, and finally, what we need to do is simply go to target and then drop the placeholder position on top of it, like so. So as you can see, we have connections being made to this text label. And this is responsive because if we go back to get submesh transform and change like so, everything's being responsive. So we're slowly getting there. So we have to set up a few things. I want to be able to control the stroke size on the connect shape layer nodes. So if we add another node and call it connection stroke size and drop it into the width. There we go. So we can control it from one place. Then finally, if we go to the connect shape first tab and add a submesh, select it, and then on the visibility tab, right click, add the comparison node, then take our data from the noise, drop it in the first field. And if I increase this number, as you can see, we have more and more lines being drawn. I'm going to add another controller here, and I can drag and drop it to here. So this way, I can control this from one place. So in essence, we have our rig created. We can simply hide these guys and we have our connections done. To style this a little bit more, I'm going to simply change the line type to auto Bezier. And instead of using shoulder target, use projection vectors. Set the first point to 0, second to 1, go to master controller, and actually I'm going to add something called control point bias and then drop it in here. So this way I can control this as well from a single place and maybe move it up a little bit, one place over here. Okay, so we have our connections drawn, as you can see. Now what we need to do is let's do a little bit of cleanup. I'm going to drop all the nodes underneath at the very bottom, group them, call this utilities, and then shape sources. Perfect. So now let's change the color of the data beans themselves. So as you remember, we use submesh on the data source ring layer to change the color of these data beans based on the value. So what we need to do is add a color material override. This way we can override the color of these data values based on specific value. We're going to use strength for that. So I'm going to use data 0 node to do this. Then I'm going to use the data from the comparison node and connect it with color material override strength. And nothing is happening because this node is actually giving us 0 and 1 values. So we need to simply multiply the strength by 100. And as you can see, this is working, but this is not correct. So here's what's happening. In our controller, we have a data which is no bigger than 30 being colored like so in red. So the submesh is working correctly, but the connect shape node is pointing to the wrong indexes. I tried troubleshooting this over a number of hours and I can't find a correct solution for this. So this is why this whole project is a fake user interface, because the connect shape node is pointing to the wrong data beans. But the data source ring, the submesh, this selection is correct. So to fix this, we have to actually take this whole submesh setup, move it to the data viz ring, select data source, disconnect this deformer, and then simply drop the submesh on top of data viz rings, deformers, connect to new index. As you can see, we have correct connections being made and correct beans colored the same way as the connect shape is working. But with this submesh node, with the color material override, we are targeting the whole setup. So simply, if you go to master controller and increase the connection limit to something like maybe 300, then every single node is connected. So finally, let's go back to stroke tab. I'm going to select gradient, Maybe change it from 0.1 to something like 0.9 to add more contrast. And I'm going to use color array. I'm going to use the main text color on this keyframe, select the second point, and use data. So this is the basic setup, and as you can see, everything is animated, everything is being connected dynamically, and we are simply using a logic gate to make those connections. Now I'm going to duplicate this setup twice and make 3 changes. So connect shape 1 is going to point to the second label, and connect shape 2 to this one. So now what we need to do is get 2 more placeholders for each of the labels that's remaining. So I'm going to turn this off to get some more responsiveness in Cavalry, and I'm going to duplicate these 2 nodes. Then to see what I'm doing is I'm actually going to drag it on top of the background shape, and if I turn them on, we can see all the green dots are being drawn in this place. But now I'm going to make a connection from the transform 1 position to the position 1 here and click on the position. So we're simply replacing the connection and change the submesh index to 1. And as you can see, this whole thing moved. Do the same thing again with the submesh transform 2. Grab the position, drop it on the placeholder position 2 on the position label, and change this to 2. As you can see, we have the placeholder responding to the position of the labels themselves, which is perfect. Go to connect shape, turn it on the shape 1, select target, and replace it with the placeholder position 1. I'm going to do the same thing on connect shape 2, target, and replace it here. That's perfect. So now let's change the color a little bit. So I'm going to pick the color array. For the shape 1, I'm going to use the orange one. So go to stroke tab, make sure the first keyframe is selected, drag and drop the data. There you go. We have replaced the connection, which is perfect. Turn this off, shape 2, same thing, keyframe selected, and select data 2. Replace the connection. So master controller, and we need 2 more connections for the data selection because we have 2 more labels. And actually, to make things interesting, I'm going to add actually 3. Because if you remember, the first connect shape node is simply select all the data points which are less than this number. For the second one, I want to ensure they won't overwrite each other. So we want to have 2 connections to the same place and want to specify a range between, let's say, 35 and 40. So that's why we need 2 connections for that. Going to call this data selection min and rename data max. And then this one is going to be called this data selection 2. So how do we do this? So if I just turn on the connect shape node, go to submesh, behavior, delete the comparison node. So now everything's being drawn, as you can see. So we need to use actually a logic gate instead. So basically, logic gate will result in outcome of 1 if both operations are correct. So if I add comparison to the first one, then grab the noise, drop it on the first field of the comparison node. Then I'm going to grab the data selection 1 minimum node and drag it on top of the second field. This way we can specify, for example, selection of 35. As you can see, the nodes are being drawn slightly different. Go to logic, and then second operation, math comparison, select it, go to noise, drop it on the first, and this one needs to be, let's say, 40, and drop it here. So let's think about this. So this option is not supposed to be less than, but it should be greater than 35. And the second one, it should be less than. So what I'm trying to do is make a selection between these two numbers. So if data is bigger than 35, greater than, then make a selection. And in this case, it has to be under 40, then, which means I'm using a less than option. And if both of these values are correct, we have a result. So as you can see, the whole thing is being drawn differently. So we are skipping the red options altogether. Now we're gonna use this data to change the color of the underlying bins. So let's go back to data language, open up submesh, select it, go to fill override, color material override. Now everything's being changed to this color. Then let's grab the logic gate, drop it on the strength, and add an expression, value times 100, because the value coming in from a logic gate is actually 0 or 1. We can't really see the result because everything's gray. So let's find our color array, and then data 1 is this, so drop it on this color, and as you can see, we have correct connections made, and the whole thing is animated and responsive. Just going to add a 0 and 1 to these layers so I know which one's which. And finally, the last layer is connect shape, and once again, we're doing the same process as before. Submesh, we already have comparison node, which is fine, and then simply I'm going to grab the last node data selection to drag and drop it on the replace connection, and I want this to be the highest. So we have data max of 100, so let's set this to maybe something like 70, and make sure this is greater than, like so. And finally, data phase rings, submesh, go to fill tab, add another color material override, drag it over here. I'm just going to add 2 to it. Then connect shape to grab this node, drop it on top of strength, add expression, value times 100, because once again, we only have values of 0 or 1 coming into this box over here. Perfect. And finally, grab data to drop it on this color. Going to close all of these nodes. And if I turn this on, and as you can see, this is pretty busy. So we can go to master controller and then make fine-tune the selections, something like maybe 15. This is like maybe 50 and 60, and the last one is maybe 85. And there you go. The whole thing is responsive, animated. You can customize it. I can easily change the value of the data itself, change the thickness of the bins. And because we set this up procedurally, you can control this from a single layer. I hope you learned something new and how to use connect shape nodes with logic gates to select different data points, to make connections, to change the color, and so on and so on. I'll make sure to include the project file in the description below with the previous example I made when I was researching this technique, including the extra test layers and this one as well, so you can poke around and see how everything is built. Thanks for watching, and see you guys next time.